this effing John Bolton interview. It's bananas.
Well, we're joined now by Donald Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton. And I'd like to start by talking about Greenland, which is, of course, an autonomous Danish territory. Denmark is a longtime ally of the United States. It's a founding NATO member. Do you think there's a case here for the United States taking control of Greenland?
I just want to say real quick, I was one of the first people to call out Trump foreign policy as imperialist. Even that being the case, one of the things that bothers me that now that everybody, Associated Press, Washington Post, New York Times, everybody is calling Trump imperialist. The thing that bothers me about that, there's no reckoning with the imperialism he's inheriting. Who is benefiting from that? Like, what kind of analysis is that? Are you thinking of Trump as just like being outside of time and history? Do you not realize that he's an expression of something? He's a symptom of something? He is a continuity of something? The colonial relations that America sustains, not just the international hierarchies, but the actual colonies, Guam, Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, the non-sovereign Pacific, the long-standing norm of territorial integrity. Whose territory? As long as you stole it 100 years ago, it's fine. But if you steal it now, it's not fine. The erasure of ongoing colonialism is a very disturbing thing. It's actually bad analysis. And when I see mainstream media talk about Trump's imperialism, it is facilitating this like erasure of the ongoing. Imagine being a Chamorro in Guam, advocating for your self-determination while America as a foreign power is controlling your fate and not letting you have self-determination. And then you're looking at everybody freaking out about Trump's imperialism.
Well, let me say first, there is zero chance that the United States is going to use force to do that.
That's amazing. So do you guys know John Bolton? This guy, he's the ultimate mustachioed neocon. There's never been a war that this guy didn't like. He confuses missiles with his cock. Warmonger. Everybody knows him as a warmonger. He's never seen a war he didn't like. He advocates for coercion, for bombing, for invasion, pretty much as the solution to every fucking problem. Remarkably, he thinks that military invasion is not the answer in the case of Greenland because it belongs to Denmark, because his track record of wanting to bomb countries has always been non-white countries. Bolton was Trump's national security advisor, responsible for sabotaging the Trump summit diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. Oh, and then in 2019, Greenland was first brought to Trump's attention. And we don't know who mentioned this to him, but there's a larger history of like classical geopoliticians, which is a euphemism for imperialists, because classical geopolitics is imperialist. But a classical geopolitician who had billionaire friends somehow got in Trump's ear about Greenland being this like immense natural resource that we could extract from, and we could strategy wash it. We can geopolitics launder it because it is a gateway to the Arctic, which has even more natural resources. And those natural resources could fall into the hands of foreign powers like China and Russia. So therefore, we ought to have Greenland. And that's why Trump initially brought up Greenland in 2019 as, you know, a kind of Louisiana purchase or whatever. And that's when John Bolton was national security advisor. So that's what he's talking about here.
The United States has long had significant security interest in Greenland. We go back to World War II, just as one example. Franklin Roosevelt put American military forces on Greenland at the invitation of the local government before Pearl Harbor, after the Danish government fell to the Nazis, because of the importance of the North Atlantic convoys, and how to resolve the current threats in the Arctic from Russia and China, especially as global warming results in more maritime passages through the Arctic Ocean, is serious not just for the United States, but for Canada and the entire NATO alliance. I think there are ways that we can have quiet conversations with Denmark and the home rule government in Greenland. I don't think it's appropriate to negotiate this in a football stadium under spotlights. And I think that quiet diplomacy is the way to go here.
What Bolton is saying here sounds reasonable if you're not thinking too hard about it. The dulcet tones of a warmonger, that kind of shit. Like, it makes the warmongering go down easier. If you don't have your critical thinking cap on, you're going to be basically fucking lulled into, supporting another Iraq war. And that's how they fucking get by half the time. They are smooth criminals, smooth war criminals. Boom. Fucking write that shit down. So, like, Warhawk Tua and smooth war criminals. So anyways, what Bolton was saying here about the strategic interests, he agrees with the premise of Trump's claims against Greenland. He agrees that, and he cites World War II. Actually, American interest in Greenland goes way back before World War II. There's never been any talk of invading it, even back in the day, though. So John Bolton is basically co-signing the idea, the goal of acquiring Greenland on national security terms. You heard him launder it. So he supports the territorial expansion. He does not support the military invasion. He thinks this ought to be happening quietly, not in the public spotlight. So he disagrees about the means. He agrees about the ends. That's troubling. Neocons are imperialists, but they're imperialists of a kind. America does not need Greenland. It does not need to control more territory. The strategy washing aspect of it is to claim that if you don't control it, others will control it. And this gets back to my point about colonial erasure. The same logic by which America still controls the fate of Guam and treats Guam as a literal sacrifice zone for U.S. military strategy. That same logic is the logic that says if we don't control Guam, China will. And that's the same logic that's being used here to say why Greenland is suddenly a national security issue. This is suddenly, so important. Everything is national security. Fuck you.
Do you agree with the end goal, which is, did you conclude in 2019 that, yes, indeed, the United States should acquire Greenland?
Mayor McCheese.
Well, we didn't get to that point because Trump blew the negotiations up. We hadn't even really started by talking about it publicly and putting the government of Denmark, democratically elected government of Denmark, in an impossible political position. This is not how you negotiate with friends and allies. It's one thing to send a signal to the Chinese and the Russians, but you don't put friends in a corner up against the wall.
So this is interesting too. Like, I attributed this to low-key racism. I think that's part of the picture. I think that's part of the explanation, because the neocons are warmongers against the darker races primarily. It depends on what you count Russia as, I guess, on some level. But the neocons are also the NATO lovers. They love them some NATO. Denmark's part of NATO. So Bolton was just saying there, that's the crux of the issue for him. You don't come at your NATO allies, who you like fantasize about when you're having sex with your wife. You fetishized the NATO alliance. You don't possibly bring military force against them. That's basically what Bolton is saying here.
Look, I'd be satisfied ultimately with full American sovereignty over Greenland. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think it's important, as my former boss, Jim Baker, used to tell me all the time, keep your eyes on the prize. The prize here is security for the United States and its treaty allies, including Denmark. It's not necessarily sovereignty.
See, it's that NATO fetish. I mean, he's right that like foreign policy ought to be about security. I just think he has like a very perverted sense of what security is and who, for whom security is, and at whose expense security must come. On all these counts, he and I are on different fucking planets. But in general, yeah, like foreign policy should be about security. The reason John Bolton thinks Greenland's important, and I would disagree with the premise there, is because we have different conceptions of what security is, how best to go about it, and for whom security is.
We have an existing bilateral treaty with Denmark, the Defense of Greenland Treaty from 1951, that could be a vehicle. And the way you deal with subjects like that is privately.
Okay, another sensitive subject, the Panama Canal. What do you make of what Donald Trump's been saying about that?
Well, again, there's not going to be any force used against the Panama Canal. It's so typically the case. Trump takes an issue where there's a
Yeah,
grain
federally
of
says John Bolton is a neoconservative. He is part of the imperialist wing of American liberalism. So, like, not all liberals are imperialists, and the neocons are the liberals who are imperialists. Trump's not, he's like orthogonal to all of this. He's not an ideological guy. He's definitely not a neocon. He's made the neocons his enemy.
what he's saying, and you lose sight of the real focus because of his bizarre approach. Panama Canal is vital for American national and economic security, and really for world trade and economic prosperity in troubled times.
Panama Canal is essential to national security and world trade, blah, blah, blah. Those statements, again, they're strategy washing. They're like national security washing. When you do securitization of something, you take an issue. It's an issue of normal politics, normal trade, whatever. And then you put a national security gloss on it. What happens in that move is that you justify extreme measures. The whole point of securitizing politics is to override democratic deliberation, to override democracy almost always. And so when you start labeling things as national security, you're creating a framework to justify doing whatever the fuck you want. And you may not think that you're doing it in order to set up an invasion, a military invasion or a bombing campaign. But when you've decided that the ends justifies the means and it's essential, it's a matter of survival or whatever, because you've labeled it a national interest. Once you've opened up that Pandora's box, you're creating a situation where it's justifiable to bomb, to invade. Why would it not be? You just said it's a matter of utmost national security, you fuckhead. So anyway, sorry.
I think many Americans, many people around the world, are concerned by the Chinese effort to gain control of sensitive port facilities.
China, okay, fact check. I can fact check Bolton. I'm not going to bother fact checking Trump, right? China does not control the Panama Canal, doesn't control any part of the Panama Canal. And it's not trying to. What's going on is that at either end of the Panama Canal, there are ports, and on either end of those ports, there's a Hong Kong company that operates. Hong Kong, not China, okay? A company, not the state, and they're operating, not controlling. This is an entirely fabricated China boogeyman. China's not trying to control shit in the Panama Canal. And if you really, like, you're a fucking war hawk like John Bolton, if you're really concerned about China making moves against the Panama Canal, how are they going to stop you from stopping them? It's America's geographic backyard. Our ability to deploy force and just bomb shit or to send in troops is infinitely greater than China's. So John Bolton, alongside everybody in fucking Washington, is scaremongering about the Panama fucking Canal and Chinese influence and shit. It's fucking fake. That's fake.
I do think there are issues with what China is up to, and I do think that it's legitimate for the United States and others who depend on the canal to raise this with the Panamanian government. That's what we should do, again, privately, quietly, and just make sure that Chinese operators, Chinese involvement, which should be minimal to begin with, does not pose a threat.
See, now that's okay, right? Like, maybe it's a waste of diplomatic capital to be spending it on paranoia about Chinese influence in the Panama Canal. That's at least rational. You have an inflated threat perception about China, but you're anchored in reality somewhat in other respects. You're not trying to like invade the canal. You don't assume, well, if we don't control it, they control it. So therefore we need to control it, and therefore we need to own it, and therefore we need to invade it. Like, he's at least foreclosing on that stuff for now. The problem is, since it's being designated a national security issue, and since Bolton agrees with that, if circumstances move around, then the bombing commences. That's one of the gateways on the way to war, is the securitization of the issue.
Former US ambassador to Panama, who you may know, John Feely, told US media that taking back the Panama Canal would require a war. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, it would require steps the United States is not going to take. This is Trump blowing steam and trying to confuse people. His supporters say this is good negotiation technique. I think it's bad negotiation technique. You don't put the government of Panama in this kind of trouble. Look, last week, the president of Panama said he wanted to work with the United States to cut off the flow.
Again, Bolton is only disagreeing with Trump's style, but not the substance. He's not. He's disagreeing with the diplomatic technique, with the strategy, but not the point, not the purpose, the premise.
Of illegal immigration from South America, people walking through Panama to get to the Rio Grande border between the U.S. and Mexico. He said that America's natural border is the Darien Gap. And for Donald Trump, who thinks illegal immigration is one of his biggest priorities, this is a statement, really remarkable statement by the president of Panama that showed a willingness to work with us to address the problem of illegal immigration. I hope Trump hasn't blown that up as well. It's one thing to be the center of attention, which Donald Trump always likes to be. It's something else to accomplish your objectives, and you shouldn't let your self-esteem get in the way of getting those objectives. Again, keep your eyes on the prize. Let's work with Panama on this Chinese operator question. I think we can resolve it.
No doubt Beijing and Moscow taking a very keen interest in everything that's being said by the president-elect. We've heard the Kremlin saying that President Putin is open to talks with Donald Trump. Do you think those talks will be productive? And is that something you'd advise him to do? Were you still his national security advisor?
Well, I'd be very worried because I think the talks are likely to focus on Ukraine, and I'm concerned about what the Trump administration policy toward Ukraine will be. I have to say, Trump's remarks on Greenland and Panama, saying he wouldn't rule out the use of force to achieve America's objectives, play into the hands of the likes of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping could say, well, you know, Taiwan is important for our national security, and I don't rule out the use of force there either. It's another demonstration Trump doesn't think of the broader consequences of what he says. In this case, very harmful to the interest of America and some of its best allies.
Some people are saying we're seeing a much more emboldened Donald Trump than we did when he first took office back in 2017. Some are calling this the no restraints maximum Trump, and of course with Elon Musk at his side. What does all of this tell us about how the next 4 years could unfold, Mr. Bolton?
It's a weird way to frame it.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily extrapolate from these kinds of remarks. Trump is famous for talking and then not following through. He's going to have a lot on his plate, starting on Inauguration Day when he tries a massive campaign to expel illegal immigrants from the country. The second term is likely to be a roller coaster ride domestically and internationally, much like the first Trump term. He does not have a philosophy. He does not do grand strategy on national security. He doesn't do policy as we normally understand that term. He
doesn't do policy as we would normally understand that term. He doesn't have a grand strategy. That's all true.
Decisions are transactional, anecdotal, ad hoc.
Transactional, anecdotal, ad hoc. I would agree with that also.
And that leads to continued uncertainty. It's bad for America's friends. The only hope I have is it's even worse for our enemies.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about this new, some are calling it a new sort of imperialist.
Oh, imperialist, everyone's saying, people are saying.
Agenda there by Donald Trump, threatening to seize the Panama Canal and Greenland, perhaps by force, perhaps not, as we've been saying. Threatening to use economic coercion to pressure Canada to become the 51st state of the United States. I mean, is there a coherent foreign...
The smart thing, so John Bolton he's emblematic. He is the avatar of the thing that Trump was running against in the 2024 election, right? And he associated himself, Bolton and the Democratic Party have become chummy and friendly. And so the neocons have no constituency. They do not represent a mass base. They don't represent fucking anybody except themselves. And so Trump's whole thing about like being against World War III, the Democrats are warmongers. Even more than running against the Democrats, he was running against the neocons. And John Bolton is like public enemy number one for who the neocons are. And so he was attacking the Democrats by associating them with the neocons, which is not incorrect.
There is no master plan. That's beyond Trump's capability. This is one thing after another. I think the motivating factor in the case of Canada is that Trump does not like Justin Trudeau, the prime minister, the outgoing prime minister. And in Trump's mind, and he said this publicly, he thinks that if he has good relations with the head of a foreign government, then the United States has good relations with that country.
There's something to that. I do kind of think that the Canada thing, like Trump's claims against Canada, 51st state, my read on that is that it's totally a troll. He's just trolling Trudeau. But that doesn't mean there aren't consequences.
And vice versa. If relations are bad at a personal level, so are state-to-state relations. That's a gross oversimplification, but that's how Trump sees it. I'm not sure Trump can pronounce the word imperialist. That's not what's motivating his thinking. It's about publicity and comments that are being made to him by people who really don't have much of an understanding of the wider world.
So I think Bolton is right. Like imperialism as an ideology has nothing to do with what Trump is saying about territorial expansion. Trump has no self-conscious ideology. But like I said earlier, America has historically been an empire, primarily in the Pacific, and it has some imperial relations even right now, right? And I say that again because liberal internationalism, which is like the larger ideology that Bolton fits within, it has worked to restrain American imperialism sometimes, you know? Even like, I think liberal internationalism is violent, militarist, hierarchical, hypocritical, right? I think liberal internationalism is largely a rhetorical justification for just world historical levels of power hoarding. You know, the policymakers' commitment, though, to liberal internationalism, despite all of that, kept in check some of the worst imperialist tendencies in American expansionism. And so in the past 100 years, territorial conquest has not been a priority for the U.S. Security, quote unquote, has been the priority, right? And so liberal internationalism, yes, it erases actually existing colonial control that the U.S. has in the Pacific and over Puerto Rico. But it's not an ideology that permits territorial expansion. So you rationalize and justify what you've already stolen, but you don't co-sign stealing more, right? So, and I say all of this because even though liberal internationalism was bullshit in a lot of ways, we might miss it when it's gone, considering what we're entering into with the new Trump era. You know, Trump has no ideology. The American imperialist impulse that he embodies is not checked by ideology. That's the real way to think about this, right? And so there's no comfort in saying that Trump is not motivated by empire. Trump is not actively trying to build an empire. That's not his motivation. It's much more idiosyncratic, personalistic, but he is pursuing empire. You don't have to be motivated by it to be producing it as an outcome, you know? So Bolton's words are cold comfort here.